They whispered her name in drawing rooms and parlors from Natchez to Vicksburg. Elise. No surname. No price tag. No equal. Some said she was too beautiful to be born in chains. Others claimed her poise alone could humiliate any white woman who stood within 10 steps of her. Mistresses who owned her fell mysteriously ill, overcome not by disease, but by a jealousy that ate them from the inside. Elise did not seduce, threaten, or rebel. She simply existed, and that alone was enough to unmake households. Plantation records called her a housemaid. Every woman in Mississippi called her a curse. Men didn't speak of her unless their wives were far away. No one ever asked Elise what she wanted. Some feared the answer. This story begins the day she was sold for the 4th time, not because she misbehaved, but because yet another plantation mistress could no longer bear to live under the same roof as her. And Elise, quiet, graceful Elise, walked into her next life with a single secret tucked in the corner of her mind. She knew exactly why every mistress who owned her eventually broke. The sun was just rising when the wagon rolled into Willowbend Plantation, carrying cotton bales, 2 crates of china, and Elise. She stepped down in silence, her bare feet touching the red Mississippi clay. Her posture was perfect, not stiff, not timid, but serene, like someone who had mastered the art of moving without ever appearing moved. Master Thaddeus Bolton watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, eyes narrowed. He had purchased dozens of slaves over 2 decades, but none had made him pause the way Elise did. She wasn't the prettiest woman he'd ever seen, though. She was close, but something about her presence unsettled him. It was the way she seemed aware of everything. The creak of the porch boards, the flutter of a sparrow, the stillness of the overseer pretending not to stare. His wife, Margaret Bolton, appeared behind him in her lace nightdress, hair uncombed, face pinched with exhaustion, a woman already losing a private battle she could not name. When she spotted Elise, she froze. "Oh," Margaret whispered, one hand gripping the doorframe. "No, not her." "Thaddeus sent her back." Thaddeus laughed. "She's a maid, Maggie, not a ghost." Margaret didn't move from the doorway. Her eyes traveled over Elise from head to toe, and her expression twisted, not fear, not disgust, but something darker. A woman who had grown up with money and social standing should not feel threatened by a slave. But Elise was not an ordinary slave. Something about her felt like an accusation. Elise curtsied, perfectly measured. "Ma'am." Her voice was soft, steady. Margaret hated it instantly. "Don't call me that," she snapped. "I don't want, just don't." Thaddeus shot his wife an irritated glance. "Maggie, she hasn't even stepped inside the house." "That's exactly why," Margaret said. The other house slaves gathered by the kitchen door, whispering among themselves. They knew about Elise. Everyone did. Rumors had traveled faster than the wagon stories of jealous wives slashing their own dresses, screaming fits in front parlors, mysterious fevers that lifted only when Elise was sold away. Some slaves believed Elise was cursed. Others believed the white women were. The truth was simpler. Any woman standing near Elise felt like a dimmer version of herself. "Come along," Thaddeus ordered. "Let's get you inside." Elise followed him through the doorway. Margaret stepped aside, but only barely, keeping her fingers tight on the doorframe as Elise passed. The scent of Elise's hair, clean, faintly floral, brushed Margaret's cheek. The mistress flinched like she'd been slapped. Inside, the house was large, but suffocatingly quiet. Elise moved through it with the same soft grace, head slightly lowered, eyes skimming details without lingering. Polished mahogany furniture, floral carpets, curtains that smelled faintly of mildew, a portrait of Margaret in younger, brighter days. Thaddeus led her to the parlor and handed her over to Mrs. Whitlock, the housekeeper, who pretended not to be rattled by Elise's presence. "She'll be dusting the sitting rooms today," Thaddeus said. "And the piano. Don't let her near Margaret too much. My wife's in one of her moods." Mrs. Whitlock nodded. Though she didn't miss the irony, Margaret was always in a mood when a beautiful slave arrived. But Elise wasn't just beautiful. She was something else, something almost painful to look at for too long. As Elise began dusting, the sunlight filtered through the window and touched her skin like it recognized her. Even Mrs. Whitlock stopped mid-task, watching her. Outside in the hallway, Margaret leaned against the wall, listening to every movement, every whisper of cloth, every quiet breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "How many times has she been sold?" Margaret asked suddenly, startling Mrs. Whitlock. "4, ma'am," the housekeeper replied. "Always from situations." "What kind of situations?" Whitlock swallowed. "The kind that involve mistresses." Margaret's hands shook. Before she could respond, Elise stepped out of the parlor holding a polished silver tray. Their eyes met. For a long, suffocating moment, neither woman spoke. Elise gave a gentle nod. Margaret felt something inside her crack, and she didn't yet know if it was fear, rage, or the first fracture of a much larger break. But Elise knew. She always knew. By the end of her first week on the Lagrange plantation, Celine had become the center of gravity without ever raising her voice. She did not seek attention. Attention simply arranged itself around her. The slaves watched her with a mix of awe and unease. The men stumbled in their steps when she passed. The women stared, suspicious and tight-jawed, wondering what kind of trouble a creature like her would bring. But none watched Celine more obsessively than Mistress Eleanor Lagrange. Eleanor had never been a beautiful woman, but she had the pride of someone who believed she deserved to be. Her skin freckled instead of glowing. Her hair curled instead of falling in sleek sheets. Her waist thickened instead of narrowing. Her husband, Charles, treated her politely, as one would treat a piece of furniture that must be dusted occasionally. And now Charles was smiling in broad daylight, because Celine had poured his tea with a graceful tilt of the wrist. Eleanor saw it. She saw everything. She watched Celine walk across the veranda with an elegance that no slave should have been allowed to possess. She watched Charles's eyes follow that elegance. She watched the field hands whisper to one another when Celine passed by with the laundry basket balanced perfectly on her hip. Her jealousy didn't grow. It detonated. It began quietly, with whispers. "Her skirt is too fitted," Eleanor complained. "It is the same skirt all the women wear," Charles replied. "Well then, hers fits too well." Charles laughed a tiny sound, barely more than breath. But it was enough. Eleanor felt it like a slap. From that moment, her mind locked onto Celine with predatory fixation. She started inventing reasons to summon her. "Celine, fetch my shawl." "Celine, stand here so I can look at you." "Celine, show me how you walk. Slower, slower." Sometimes she would stare at the girl for minutes without speaking, as if trying to find a flaw invisible to everyone else. Celine answered every command with a bow of the head and a quiet, "Yes, mistress," but her calmness only fueled Eleanor's rage. One night, after Charles complimented Celine's stitching on his cuffs, Eleanor tore every dress from her wardrobe, ripping seams with her bare hands, sobbing into the torn silk. "She thinks she can outshine me," Eleanor hissed. "A slave girl, a nobody. I'll burn that prettiness off her face." The next morning, she ordered Celine to attend to her alone in the upstairs sitting room. Celine climbed the stairs with her usual quiet grace, unaware that Eleanor had spent half the night pacing, trembling, rehearsing her cruelty. Eleanor stood with a silver hairbrush in her hand, her mother's hairbrush, the one she had treasured since childhood, and she slammed it on the table the moment Celine entered. "You think yourself special," Eleanor said. Celine did not answer. Her stillness only angered the mistress more. "You think men look at you because of something you've done?" Eleanor spat. "No. They look because they're weak. You make them weak." Celine's eyes flickered just barely. But Eleanor saw it. "You will learn your place," Eleanor whispered. She reached forward suddenly, gripping Celine's chin so hard her fingers left white marks. To her frustration, Celine didn't flinch. Her calmness was unbearable. It felt like mockery. Then, without warning, Eleanor raised the hairbrush and struck Celine across the cheek. Celine swayed but did not fall. A thin line of blood appeared near her lip, bright against her dark skin. And still, Celine did not speak. That silence was the moment Eleanor snapped. She struck her again. And again. Each blow wilder, more hysterical, more desperate. Celine remained quiet, absorbing the cruelty with the composure of someone who had suffered far worse in places no one ever saw. But Eleanor did not know this. All she knew was that she could not break the girl. When her rage finally burned itself out, Eleanor stood shaking, chest heaving, hair sticking to her damp forehead. Celine lifted her eyes slowly, softly, and looked at her with something Eleanor had never expected. Pity. Not fear. Not hatred. Pity. The mistress stumbled backward as if pushed. That night, the rumor spread across the slave quarters. Mistress Eleanor beat Celine. But what no one knew not yet was that Eleanor would not sleep. Not that night, nor the next. Because every time she closed her eyes, she saw Celine's bruised cheek and that terrible, unbearable look of pity. By midsummer, the plantation had split into two camps, those who adored Elise's sweetness, and those who whispered that her sweetness was an illusion crafted for destruction. The mistresses were firmly in the second group. It happened quietly at first. Mrs. Alden collapsed during sewing circle, dizzy and unable to speak for several minutes. Mrs. Penwick woke one morning with a rash crawling across her throat like red vines. Clara Beaumont fainted twice during church sermon, claiming she felt a pressure on her lungs, as if a hand were squeezing from the inside. Each of them blamed the heat, but the overseer's wife, Ruthin Miller, blamed Elise. "Elise walks in a room," she hissed to Clara, "and your husband looks at her like she hung the moon. Don't pretend you haven't seen it." Clara had seen it. She had lived it. For 10 years she had been the diamond of Vicksburg, perfect posture, perfect curls, perfect marriage, until Elise arrived. Until her husband began asking unnecessary questions about the weather if Elise answered, until he stood a little too close when she washed tea sets, until Clara felt herself shrinking beside a woman she legally owned. It was humiliation wrapped in silk, and humiliation, for white women of Mississippi, fermented into violence. 3 weeks after their church fainting spell, Clara and the others held a secret meeting in the orchard. A slave wasn't supposed to walk through the orchard at night, but Elise did, barefoot and silent as a moth. She stood behind a tree trunk, listening as the wives, red-faced and trembling, discussed how to humble her. "We'll cut that hair first," Ruthin spat. "Make her plain. And those dresses she stitches," Clara added. "Let her sew burlap until her hands bleed." "She thinks she's better than us," another whispered. "We'll remind her what she is." They planned it for the next morning before breakfast, before the men woke, before Elise could charm anyone into defending her. But Elise was already 4 steps ahead. She visited the perfume shed that night, where the mistress kept her oils, lavender, rose, magnolia, the scents of southern womanhood. Elise's fingers found a small vial hidden behind the shelves. A vial her mother once warned her never to open unless she needed a weapon without a blade. Rue oil. Mixed wrong, it caused rashes. Mixed right, it caused sickness. They called it witch time in Haiti. Elise didn't touch the ladies' perfume bottles. She touched the dye pots, because she knew what the wives were planning. Before sunrise, the women stormed her cabin, 6 mistresses in nightgowns and fury. Elise stood expressionless, hands folded, silent as they seized her. They dragged her to the yard, ropes in hand. "Hold her still," Clara ordered. 2 mistresses pinned Elise's arms. Another grabbed the shears. The blades closed around Elise's long, dark hair and slid uselessly. The moment the scissors closed, Clara screamed. She clutched her fingers, which had blistered instantly, angry red bubbles rising across her skin. What is this?" she gasped. The other mistresses dropped the ropes, staring at their own reddening fingers. A burning itch crawled up their wrists, spreading under their skin like fire. Elise stepped backward, face unreadable. "I wouldn't touch dye pots before sunrise, if I were you," she said softly. The women stared at her, horror blooming. What did you do?" Clara choked. "I only colored the cloth you planned to cut my hair with," Elise answered. "If harming me is your pleasure, then pain is the price you pay." Ruthin spat at her feet. "Witch!" "That word doesn't scare me," Elise replied. By noon, the women were covered in rashes. By evening, feverish. Clara Beaumont fainted again, this time not in church, but in her own parlor, and suddenly the plantation murmured a new phrase. "Don't cross Elise. She's touched by spirits." The men did not believe it. The women believed it too much. But Elise? She simply continued her sewing, quiet, elegant, knowing that a war had begun long before the wives realized they were losing. The Hardings held their annual spring dinner, an evening of lace, lanterns, and laughter meant to flaunt wealth to neighboring families. Magnolia trees dripped blossoms over the courtyard, violins hummed in the night air, and every mistress wore a smile tight enough to crack porcelain. Yet beneath those smiles was tension sharp, heavy, and aimed entirely at one woman, Celestine. She moved through the courtyard with a silver tray against her hip, her posture straight, her steps light, and her eyes lowered just enough to be proper but never low enough to hide her beauty. Women whispered behind gloved fingers as she passed, their jealousy collecting like storm clouds. Men, no matter how devoutly they clung to their wives' arms, could not help following her with their gaze. Mrs. Harding had prepared for this night with a fervor bordering on obsession. She dressed herself in the richest blue silk she owned, pinned sapphire earrings to her ears, and fastened her hair so tight the skin at her temples shone. Yet the moment Celestine stepped into the lamplight, the mistress felt herself vanish beside her. Mrs. Harding hissed instructions. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not smile. Do not lift your eyes above their knees. And stay in the shadows. But shadows had never been able to contain Celestine. As the evening unfurled, Mrs. Dupree, the loudest, pettiest woman in the county, cornered Mrs. Harding with a saccharine smile. I must ask, why do you keep that one so close? She said, tipping her chin toward Celestine, as if gesturing toward a venomous snake. I hear husbands praise her more than they praise their own wives. Mrs. Harding's spine stiffened. She is a servant. Nothing more. Oh dear, Mrs. Dupree cooed. Servants with pretty faces have ruined entire cities. Behind them, Celestine stood still, holding a pitcher of sweet tea. She heard every word just as she had every whispered rumor, every hissed warning, every envious lie told about her. She could feel their jealousy tightening around her throat like a rope. But she simply lowered her eyes and waited. Later in the night, Judge Redmont approached Celestine with the wobble of a man too deep into bourbon. His wife fanned herself nearby, pretending not to watch. The judge leaned close, breath thick with liquor. You're wasted in the field. Pretty thing like you should be in the house. Serving. Special duties. Celestine stepped back, expression neutral. But Mrs. Harding saw the judge's hand reaching, saw his wife's cheeks reddening with humiliation, saw every mistress nearby tense like hunting dogs catching scent. Jealousy spread through the courtyard like wildfire. Mrs. Harding snapped, Celestine, to the kitchen, now. Celestine obeyed, gliding away without a word, but her calmness infuriated the mistress more. The kitchen was hot, crowded, clanging with pots and the shouts of cooks, but Celestine, as always, moved like water, smooth, silent. Minutes later, Mrs. Harding burst in behind her. Do you enjoy humiliating me? She hissed. Celestine blinked slowly. No, ma'am. What did you say to the judge? Nothing, ma'am. That's the problem. The mistress slammed her palm on the wooden table. You think your silence is innocence, but it only makes men want you more. Celestine lowered her gaze. I do nothing but work. That is the lie you hide behind. Mrs. Harding stepped closer, her breath trembling. You think I don't see how they look at you? Celestine finally lifted her eyes dark, calm, reflecting none of the mistress's fury. I cannot control how they look, ma'am. Mrs. Harding froze, because somewhere beneath her anger, she knew it was true. But jealousy does not bow to truth. It feeds on it. The mistress spun away, flustered, shaken, humiliated by her own insecurity. And the more Celestine remained serene, the more Mrs. Harding felt her authority cracking. Back in the courtyard, the guests resumed their gossip, louder now, more vicious, more reckless. They whispered that Mrs. Harding's beauty had faded, that her husband's eye wandered, that Celestine's presence was a threat no respectable woman should endure. Every mistress watched Celestine from that moment forward, not because she had done something wrong, but because she existed. Near midnight, lanterns dimmed, and the last of the guests drifted toward their carriages. Thunder trembled in the distance, though the air remained dry. The plantation seemed to hold its breath as Celestine stepped from the kitchen to extinguish the courtyard lamps. Mrs. Harding watched her from the balcony, her silhouette rigid against the moonlight. She felt it then, something she had never confessed even to herself. Fear, not of Celestine's beauty, but of how deeply it exposed her own ugliness. And that fear was about to drive her toward a decision that would change all their lives. Ilara had lived in 3 plantations by now, and each one had tried and failed to keep her hidden. Mistresses whispered, traded warnings, crossed themselves as if she carried a biblical curse. Don't let her near your husband. Don't let her near your sons. Don't let her near your mirrors. But it was the 4th household, the Belfont estate, that finally tipped the balance from envy into obsession. The mistress, Eugenia Belfont, was unlike the others. Jealousy did not eat her slowly, it possessed her from the moment she laid eyes on Ilara. She was tall, rigid, with a face carved by permanent displeasure. Her husband, Colonel Abram Belfont, was a man known for his temper and his inability to keep his eyes from wandering. When Ilara stepped off the wagon, Eugenia froze mid-sentence. Her hand tightened on her parasol until the bamboo cracked. The new slave's posture, the way sunlight caught her cheekbones, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, it all struck Eugenia with the force of a blade. No words were exchanged, no welcome. Just a stiff nod and a tremor in the corner of Eugenia's mouth. By nightfall, the mistress had ordered Ilara to sleep in a storage shed beside the smokehouse. She told the house staff it was precaution, but everyone understood the real reason. The Belfont mansion had mirrors in nearly every room. Eugenia would not allow Ilara's reflection inside. But it was too late. Colonel Belfont had seen her. He caught only a glimpse of Ilara carrying folded linens across the yard, yet it was enough to plant a spark of fascination. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered every time she crossed his path, and Eugenia felt it. Her jealousy sharpened into paranoia. She forbade Ilara from speaking unless spoken to. She assigned tasks meant to ruin her appearance, scrubbing ash pits, hauling muddy buckets, cleaning chicken coops, but Ilara never lost her poise. It was infuriating. Even covered in soot, she looked composed. Even knee-deep in muck, she seemed more dignified than the mistress herself. The breaking point came on a humid afternoon when Eugenia discovered Abram standing by the window, watching Ilara hang laundry. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared as though hypnotized. Eugenia's voice cut through the air like a scream wrapped in silk. "Do you admire her?" Abram blinked, startled. You were staring." He opened his mouth, but she struck him with the back of her hand. He stumbled, stunned more by the audacity than the force. No one dared speak to Abram that way. No one struck him. But Eugenia was past fear. That evening, she summoned Ilara to the main house for the first time since her arrival. Ilara entered cautiously. The air smelled of violets and rage. Eugenia sat in the parlor, hands folded neatly, eyes glowing with something both brittle and poisonous. "You have bewitched my husband," she said flatly. Ilara did not react. "No, ma'am." "You lie." Eugenia stood, pacing. "Every mistress who owned you suffered. Everyone. And now you bring your curse here." "It isn't a curse," Ilara said quietly. "It's just how they choose to see me." The honesty, the calmness, enraged Eugenia more than denial would have. She grabbed a pair of sewing shears from the table beside her and approached Ilara with trembling hands. "Beauty is nothing without hair," she hissed. "Let's see what you are when your crown is gone." But when she reached for Ilara's curls, Ilara stepped back, not in fear, but with a quiet firmness that shocked the mistress into stillness. "Don't," Ilara whispered. That single word struck like a whip, not defiant, not pleading, simply a boundary, a forbidden thing in a place where slaves had none. Eugenia's face twisted with a fury too large for her body. She lunged. The parlor doors slammed open. Colonel Abram stormed in, grabbing Eugenia's wrist just before the blades touched Ilara's head. The shears clattered to the floor. Eugenia gasped as though struck. Abram's voice rumbled. "Have you lost your mind?" Eugenia jerked away, shaking. "She's stealing you. She steals everyone." Ilara stepped back, head bowed, heart pounding. She did not want the colonel's protection. It only made things worse, but she couldn't control the storm building between husband and wife. Eugenia's breath came shallow and ragged. "If she stays," she said, voice sharp as broken glass. "I will burn this house down with the three of us inside." For the first time, Abram did not dismiss her rage, because he believed her. The night the jealousy finally turned visible began with nothing more dangerous than the clatter of spoons in the dining hall. The plantation hosted a supper for neighboring families, the Waverleys, the Harts, the Leclercs, all eager to catch a glimpse of the elegant slave they'd heard whispered about like a forbidden ghost. Isadora moved through the tables like drifting perfume. Every step she took drew eyes. Every turn of her wrist made someone sigh without meaning to. The mistresses noticed. Of course they did. Mrs. Hart elbowed her husband each time. His gaze lingered longer than a polite glance. Mrs. Leclerc slid her wine glass across the table so sharply it spilled when her son dared to whisper. Her posture, astonishing. But the worst was Mrs. Waverley, a woman whose insecurity was so thick it clung to her like sweat. She watched Isadora with a trembling jaw, teeth biting down on envy as if trying to swallow it whole. And by the end of the night, she snapped. It happened subtly, at first a scraped chair, a sharp inhale, the tension of a thread stretching too tight. Miss Lucinda Beaumont, the plantation mistress, and Isadora's new owner, tried to maintain decorum. She smiled too hard, laughed too loud, poured drinks with trembling hands. She adored Isadora, and hated that she adored her. Isadora was everything she wanted to be: graceful without trying, beautiful without vanity, poised without cruelty. Lucinda hated herself for noticing that. After dessert, the guests drifted to the veranda for brandy. The mistresses followed like vultures circling a carcass, except the carcass was their pride, and the vulture was their jealousy. Mrs. Waverley cornered Lucinda first. "You must prune your garden," she said sweetly. "A flower that draws too much attention can endanger the gardener." Lucinda knew exactly who she meant. Before she could reply, Mrs. Hart stepped closer. "My husband," said she. "Mine too." "She shouldn't. It's indecent. She undermines you." Their voices blurred into a hissing hive. Lucinda's face stiffened. She knew. Of course she knew. Jealousy had a taste metallic, unmistakable, and tonight it coated her tongue. Isadora, unaware, stepped onto the veranda with a tray of cordials. And the moment the candlelight touched her face, every man glanced up as if drawn by a magnet hidden beneath her skin. That was the moment Mrs. Waverley snapped the porcelain handkerchief case in her hand. The crack was small, soft, like a tiny bone breaking, but everyone heard it. She marched toward Isadora with the expression of a woman stepping into a duel. "Slave," she spat, "hold your head higher. If you insist on flaunting yourself before married men, at least do it properly." The men stiffened. Lucinda's stomach dropped. The other mistresses exchanged satisfied smirks. Isadora lifted her chin, not with arrogance, but with dignity, the kind of dignity that made insecure women burn with an anger they couldn't explain. Mrs. Waverley stepped closer, close enough that Isadora could smell her expensive French perfume trembling under her rage. "Look at me, girl," she hissed. Isadora obeyed, which made it worse. Something about Isadora's eyes, calm, steady, unimpressed, set Mrs. Waverley aflame. Her hand lifted, shaking, as if itching to slap, claw, or tear. But she didn't. She did something worse. She reached out and ran her fingers through Isadora's hair. Slowly, insultingly, possessively. Then she curled her fist around a handful of Isadora's curls and whispered, "This beauty will be the end of you." Lucinda lunged forward. "Clara, that is not your property." Mrs. Waverley released the hair and smiled thin, poisonous. "Then control her, Lucinda, before she controls your household." The mistresses filed out one by one, leaving Lucinda humiliated and trembling. Isadora stood perfectly still, eyes forward, shoulders steady. But her hands shook only a little, only for a moment as she lowered the tray to the floor. Lucinda stepped closer. "You must be more careful," she whispered, trying to sound firm, but her voice cracked somewhere in the middle. Isadora lifted her eyes. "I did nothing, ma'am." "I know," Lucinda whispered. "That's what frightens them." And then, quieter. "That's what frightens me." Isadora bowed her head, but she said nothing. Because she'd heard it too, the truth trembling in Lucinda's voice like a candle about to gut her out. Beauty wasn't her blessing. Elegance wasn't her weapon. Grace wasn't her sin. Being unforgettable was, and every mistress who laid eyes on her knew it. Whether she wanted to or not, Isadora was becoming a threat, and threats never lived long on southern plantations. The grand plantation home had never glowed so brightly. Lanterns dangled from every column, silver trays floated through the halls, and violins whined like delicate ghosts. The Ballards' annual masquerade evening was the most anticipated event in the county, attended by the wealthiest planters, smug merchants, and tight-laced ladies dripping with pearls. And every single one of them was talking about her. Celeste. She moved through the preparations like a quiet breeze, adjusting tablecloths, straightening chairs, and gliding from room to room as if the house itself bowed to her. Even masked servants from neighboring plantations paused to stare, though they did so only when no overseer was watching. Mrs. Judith Ballard watched too, but her stare was nothing soft. It carried the weight of suspicion sharpened by months of jealousy, by nights when her husband's eyes lingered too long on Celeste's silhouette as she poured wine, by whispers from other mistresses that your husband's reputation is quite appreciative. And tonight, Judith meant to end all of that. She wore a deep emerald gown with sleeves puffed high and a waist cinched so tightly she could barely breathe. Jewels glittered on her fingers like weaponry. She felt victorious, beautiful for once, powerful for once. Yet when Celeste emerged from the servants' corridor, carrying a tray of crystal goblets, Judith's victory crumbled into ash. Even in her simple cream dress, even with no jewelry and hair pulled back in a neat knot, Celeste glowed with a radiance that looked unfair, moonborn, untouchable. The guests noticed immediately. A group of ladies near the staircase whispered behind fluttering lace fans. There she is, the one they talk about. Good Lord, she's stunning. No wonder Judith can't stand her. Celeste heard every word, but she kept her face calm and distant, a little expression she had practiced as armor. Mr. Henry Ballard noticed too. His mask was gold, but it did not hide how his eyes softened at the sight of her. Celeste never returned that look, never encouraged it, but the look existed all the same, plain as sunlight. That was enough to poison Judith's blood. By the time the music began and guests took to dancing, Judith had made her decision. She would humiliate Celeste so thoroughly, so irreversibly, that no one, not Henry, not the guests, not another mistress in all of Mississippi would ever see elegance in her again. She waited for the right moment. It came when Celeste leaned over to refill the punch bowl. Judith approached, her emerald skirts swishing like an approaching storm. "Your posture is atrocious," she said loudly, loud enough for nearby guests to turn. "Stand up straight. You look like a farm animal bowing to drink." Celeste slowly straightened. Her hands trembled, but her face remained calm. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Judith stepped closer. "Bow again," she commanded. "I want to see how low you can go." Celeste froze. Gasps rippled outward like a shock wave. Judith's smile stretched sharp and triumphant. "What, you disobey now? Before all my guests?" Still, Celeste did not move. Henry Ballard stiffened in the doorway. "Judith," he warned quietly, but she was too far gone. She reached out and slammed her hand into the punch ladle Celeste was holding, sending red liquid splashing across the girl's dress and down her arms. Celeste staggered back, breathing hard, her dignity collapsing in slow motion. "Oh dear," Judith said sweetly. "Look at you, clumsy and filthy." The room had fallen silent. Every eye watched. Every breath froze. Something inside Celeste snapped, but she hid it well. She placed the ladle down. She bowed her head. She whispered, "Excuse me, ma'am. I'll clean it." Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. But if anyone had seen her eyes as she passed through the doorway, truly seen them, they would have stepped out of her path. For Celeste was no longer elegant. She was dangerous. And Judith Ballard had just lit a fuse she did not know existed. By late summer, the plantation no longer felt like a place where cotton grew. It felt like a place where jealousy lived. Every woman, every mistress who visited, every respectable lady who stepped into Clarendon House could not help but stare at Alara. They tried to hide it behind folded fans and polite smiles, but the envy leaked out of their eyes like bitterness through cracks. Mrs. Clarendon had grown thinner. Her dresses hung loose on her shoulders. Her hair seemed perpetually frazzled, and she had developed a habit of biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. The slightest mention of Ilara's name made her hands tremble. The worst part? Ilara didn't raise her voice, didn't flirt, didn't behave proudly. She simply existed gracefully, beautifully, calmly, and that alone inflamed the mistress like a fever that had no cure. So, when the Clarendon Ladies' Society announced it would gather for an evening of tea and supper, Mrs. Clarendon did something she had never done before. She ordered Ilara to serve, not in the kitchen, not at the door, but in the parlor. Before every woman who already whispered that Ilara's face could unmake a home, Ilara said nothing, simply nodded. But inside, she felt a chill. She knew a trap when she walked into one. The parlor gleamed with polished wood and gold-rimmed teacups. The chandeliers burned like hot suns overhead. Pearls, lace, and jewels shimmered as the ladies took their seats, pretending they were here for gossip and pastries instead of blood sport. Everyone knew the unspoken theme of the gathering. Compare the mistress to the slave. When Ilara stepped in with the tray balanced in her steady hands, the room froze. Fans paused mid-flutter. A spoon clinked against a saucer. "Good heavens," whispered Mrs. Cotting. "She is more stunning than the rumors say. She looks like she stepped out of a painting," breathed another. Mrs. Clarendon stiffened. Ilara moved gently, placing teacups before each lady. Her eyes stayed low, her voice soft, her steps controlled. She knew that if she lifted her chin even slightly, if she allowed her beauty to be acknowledged, Mrs. Clarendon would snap like a brittle branch. But jealousy is a silent poison. It needs no spark to burn. When Ilara passed behind Mrs. Calder's chair, the woman accidentally shifted her elbow. The fine china teapot tipped, and steaming liquid splashed across Ilara's wrist. The parlor gasped. Mrs. Calder smirked. Mrs. Clarendon hid a small, vicious satisfaction. Ilara did not yelp. She did not flinch. She whispered an apology for disturbing the table and continued serving. That, more than anything, enraged the mistress. Humility, grace, calmness. Mrs. Clarendon possessed none of them anymore. When the guests finally left, glowing with delicious cruelty, Mrs. Clarendon stormed into the hall like a tempest. "You made a fool of me tonight," she hissed, grabbing Ilara by the arm. Ilara blinked. "Ma'am, I only served." "Do not speak as though you are innocent," the mistress shrieked. "You stood there with your perfect face and your perfect posture, my husband, looking at you. Those women comparing us." She shoved Ilara backward, slamming her into the mirrored cabinet. The mirror cracked like a screaming throat. Mrs. Clarendon froze, breathing hard. Ilara stood motionless, the shards glittering behind her like a halo of broken glass. "That face," the mistress whispered. "That cursed face. I want it gone." She lifted her hand, but someone grabbed it mid-air. Mr. Clarendon. His voice was low, but it struck like thunder. "That is enough." Mrs. Clarendon jerked her hand free, horrified not because she had nearly harmed Ilara, but because her husband had protected her. In that frozen second, something clicked behind the mistress's eyes. A crack, subtle but deadly, like a mirror beginning to split. Without another word, she strode from the room, heels clattering like gunshots. Ilara remained still, chest rising slowly, refusing to tremble. Mr. Clarendon turned to her. "Did she hurt you?" "No, sir." "Did those women hurt you?" "No, sir." His jaw tightened. "You may retire for the night." She bowed her head. But as the master walked away, Ilara looked toward the fractured mirror at her reflection splintered into a dozen pieces. She knew a storm was gathering, and she knew she would not survive it by standing still. Jealousy was not done with her, not by a long shot. The Fuller mansion had never known silence. Its hallways were always alive, heels tapping, skirts brushing marble, arguments echoing behind doors. But on the night everything changed. It was so quiet that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Arabella moved through that silence like someone walking through a dream. She had spent an hour preparing for bed, brushing her hair until it flowed like polished riverstone, smoothing her nightgown, applying lavender oil to her wrists. Yet none of it slowed the storm spiraling beneath her ribs. Because tonight, she could feel it. Not just jealousy, not just fear, a kind of sickness, a rotting sweetness that no doctor could diagnose. The same sickness that had claimed the last mistress who'd tried to own Celestine. In her room downstairs, Celestine sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the floorboards as if they might speak. All day, she had felt eyes on her, the masters, the guests, even the housemaids. But the pair that troubled her most belonged to Arabella. Arabella had a way of watching her that wasn't hatred, but hunger. The hunger of someone losing a war inside her own bones. Celestine whispered into the dark, "Tonight it will break." She didn't know how. She only knew something would. Upstairs, Arabella paced. Her breath came uneven, ragged. She held a hand to her chest and felt her pulse hammering like a fist on a locked door. The physician had given her a tonic, calling it a nervous fever. But she knew better. It had started the morning Celestine arrived. It grew every time the master's eyes lingered too long. It burned whenever a guest admired that impossible beauty. Jealousy had hollowed her ribs. Envy had hung itself from her spine. Suspicion gnawed constantly at the edges of her sanity. But tonight the sickness felt like it had teeth. She leaned toward her mirror, expecting her reflection to look normal. It didn't. Her face was pale, drained. Her forehead glistened with a cold sheen of sweat. Her pupils were wide, too wide, like someone who had stared too long into fire and lost themselves in the blaze. "Why does she have the power to make me feel this way?" Arabella whispered. "She's just a slave. Just a girl." But the mirror didn't agree. It showed a woman unraveling, and downstairs, Celestine felt that unraveling wrap around her like a storm wind through cane fields. She stood. Tonight, she decided, she would face it. Running no longer worked. Avoiding didn't help. If Arabella's sickness was tied to her, then only she could cure it. She stepped into the hallway, lantern in hand. The flame trembled violently as if afraid of the night itself. The mansion creaked just once like a warning. Celestine moved anyway. Upstairs, Arabella pressed a trembling hand to the mirror. Her vision blurred, her ears rang, her breath turned sharp and cold. It felt like something was climbing up her spine soft, dragging fingers that were not her own. She blinked. The face in the mirror blinked half a second later. Arabella stumbled back. No. Her reflection smiled a slow, wrong smile. Then someone knocked. A gentle knock. Soft. Human. "Miss Arabella?" Celestine's voice murmured through the door. "I need to speak with you. May I come in?" Arabella's pulse kicked violently. Celestine. Here. Now. The very girl whose presence made the walls of her sanity crack. But something in her fear or obsession dragged her feet toward the door. She opened it. Celestine stood framed by lantern glow, shadows curling around her like ribbons. She looked impossibly calm, too calm. Arabella's voice came out as a trembling whisper. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," Celestine said softly, "but the sickness you feel, it's not yours. It's what this house carries. What jealousy leaves behind when it festers long enough." Arabella stared at her. "How would you know that?" "Because every mistress before you felt it too." A shiver rippled through Arabella's arms. Celestine stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a whispering thud, the sound of a coffin lid settling. Arabella backed away. Her reflection in the mirror leaned forward. Celestine's eyes flicked toward it. "It's begun, hasn't it?" Arabella clutched her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." The mirror flickered, the candlelight bending strangely across the glass. Arabella's reflection twisted its features, softening into a shape that wasn't fully hers. Another woman's cheekbones, another woman's lips, another woman's fury. The woman who had died in this room 17 years before. "Arabella," Celestine murmured, stepping closer. "You're not the first mistress to fall ill from jealousy, but you can be the last." Arabella's breath came out broken. "I don't understand." Celestine touched her hand. The mirror cracked. Not a full shatter, just a single, thin fracture, like a vein of lightning across the glass. Arabella froze. Celestine whispered, "You're not losing your mind. The jealousy in this house is alive." The reflection smiled with someone else's mouth. Arabella screamed. Lantern light exploded. Shadows whipped across the room, and Celestine grabbed Arabella's shoulders before she could collapse. "Look at me," Celestine commanded. "I am not your enemy." The mirror rattled. its frame shaking violently. Celestine tightened her grip. But whatever is in this house, whatever jealousy left behind, it wants you. Arabella's breath hitched. Why? Why me? Celestine whispered the truth like a confession. Because you're the first mistress who ever feared losing him. And in that moment, as the mirror cracked again, Arabella realized this sickness might not want to kill her. It might want to wear her.